visual compendium of different scientific papers and own works on the relationship between temperature and CO2 in the geological past, proxy, and in the present. The historical series of global temperature measured with satellites indicates a clear warming, especially in the last 45 years, with 2023 to 2024 being the warmest years on satellite records. However, the current global temperature is not warm. It is only 1.2 degrees Celsius higher than in 1850, one of the coldest years in the last 10,000. The current climate is the coldest of any interglacial period of the last 420,000 years, and one of the coldest of the last 485 million years. Executive summary. 2. Historically and geologically, there have been many periods when temperatures rose as fast or even faster than now, without any human influence. Current global warming began 300 years ago, predating the Industrial Revolution. No consistent correlation exists between CO2 and temperature in the past. If a correlation is present, it is often inverse. Temperature increases often preceded rises in CO2 levels. Executive summary. 3. Since 1970, there has been an increase in recorded natural disasters, mainly due to the increased placement of human assets and wealth in the destructive path of nature, but not because there has been more extreme weather events. Glaciers worldwide, on average, have been shrinking at about the same rate since at least 1825, while significant CO2 emissions only began in 1950. The current level of CO2, 0.042% of the atmosphere, is one of the lowest in Earth's history and far from optimal for plant growth, which thrives at much higher levels. At 2 times or 3 times the current atmospheric CO2 level, plants not only grow more, but also need less water, which increases agricultural productivity. After a warm 2023 and 2024, air and sea temperatures in 2025 in various parts of the globe seem to be returning to the 30 years average, 1991 to 2020 median. Subarctic sea ice extent, after growing between 1952 to 1970 and shrinking between 1979 and 2004, no statistically significant decline has been observed since 2005. And Antarctic sea ice extent, after being stable since 1979, it experienced a decline in 2023 to 2024, but in 2025 seems to be returning to the average 1979 to 2020. The change since 1850 in the configuration of the Earth's magnetism could be increasing the activity of oceanic ridges and changing the oceanic currents. So part of the heat may be coming from beneath our feet. The sudden temperature increase in 2023 and 2024 could also have been strongly influenced by the eruption of Hunga Tonga in 2022. Global warming is primarily driven by natural cycles. Humans are not the control factor. The greenhouse effect of CO2 is minimal, especially when compared to atmospheric H2O. There is no man-made climate crisis. An entirely separate issue from climate change and its causes is the pollution of ecosystems with unrecycled chemicals. However, CO2 is not a pollutant, but rather the most essential nutrient for plants. This is how climate alarmists present the long-term trend of global temperatures from 65 million years ago to the present, to generate climate panic. Note the heterogeneity of the timescale to obfuscate the context, as well as the alarmist predictions from 2020 onwards based on simplistic and flawed models. And this is how the global temperature anomalies over the past 65 million years should be presented. The current climate is one of the coldest of the last 65 million years. For most of the past 500 million years, global temperatures appear to have been too warm for persistent polar ice caps. The most recent 50 million years are an exception. Compared to most of Earth's history, today is unusually cold. We now live in what geologists call an ice age. NOAA. Global temperature over the past 65 million years, compared to 1850 to 1900 mean. NOAA. Today's atmospheric CO2 is like it was 4.3 million years ago, when temperature was 7 degrees Fahrenheit 3.9 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial. Sea level was 75 Hungarian forints higher than today, and large forests occupied what today is the tundra. So CO2 is not the control knob. Reconstruction of atmospheric CO2 black line and temperature red line during the last 65 million years Cenozoic. Most of the time, both variables move in opposite directions, which is contrary to the correlation argued by the IPCC. The atmospheric CO2 proxy in black is given in ppm parts per million. The temperature proxy shown in red is given in D18O units. That is the fraction of oxygen 18 in the atmosphere, a function of atmospheric temperature. Approximate surface temperature averages, GAST, are given on the right side of the plot. Today we are near the minimum temperature for the past 65 million years. What's the hottest Earth's ever been? Preliminary results from a Smithsonian Institution project led by Scott Wing and Brian Huber, showing Earth's average surface temperature over the past 500 million years. For most of the time, global temperatures appear to have been too warm, red portions of line, or persistent polar ice caps. The most recent 50 million years are an exception. Compared to most of Earth's history, today is unusually cold. We now live in what geologists call an interglacial, a period between glaciations of an ice age. According to a new study by Judd et al., the Earth's temperature has been declining for the last 50 million years. And quite contrary to what the climate alarmists say, instead of living in a time of high temperatures today, we are almost at the coldest point since geological records have been kept. New study by E.J. Judd et al., reconstructing the temperature of the last 485 million years, published in Science in Sept 2024. It shows that the Earth's temperature has been declining for the last 50 million years. Quite contrary to what the climate alarmists say, instead of living today in a time of high temperatures, we are almost at the coldest point since geological records have been kept. Global temperature peaked around 100 million years ago at 36 degrees Celsius, about 21 degrees Celsius higher than today. We can also see that CO2 and temperature do not correlate. They just do. Now yes, now no, now yes, now no, now no, now yes. That's not correlation. The Judd et al. Study shows a history of wild temperature shifts and that the Earth is at one of its coldest points in the last 485 mi. But at the same time, it conveys the three classic alarmist messages that 1. Today it is too hot. 2. The current warming is man-made. 3. This warming is unprecedented. September 19, 2024. Yet with the climate alarmists' own graphs, we can see that all interglacial periods over the last 420,000 years have had higher temperatures than today, and that for many periods temperatures rose at a rate equal to or much faster than the present. In the past, there is no correlation between atmospheric CO2 and temperature. If any, CO2 increases follow the temperature increases. All periods between glaciations had temperatures higher than today's. Reconstructed global temperatures over the last 420,000 years based on the Vostok ice core from the Antarctica. The horizontal line indicates the average temperature of 1,850 to 1,900 AD. In the timeline, T equal to 2023 AD. All periods between glaciations had temperatures higher than today's. It is likely that the Earth will enter a new ice age sometime in the next 5,000 to 10,000 years. No consistent correlation exists between CO2 and temps in the past. If a correlation is present, it is often inverse. Temp increases often preceded CO2 rises, except since 1980. The past temperature changes show no relation to the past atmospheric CO2 content. Reconstructed global temperatures, color bars, and atmospheric CO2 red line over the last 140,000 years, based on the Epica ice core from the Antarctica and recent NOAA measurements. If there were a clear correlation between temperature and CO2, as the climate alarmists say, and the temperature rose in parallel behind CO2, if all of humanity died today, according to their hypothesis, net zero would be reached at once, but CO2 would still be at 420 ppm, and the temperature would continue to rise sharply. The past temperature drastic changes show no relation to the past atmospheric CO2 in the last 11,000 years. The upper panel shows the air temperature in Celsius at the summit of the Greenland ice sheet, reconstructed by ALI 2000 from GIST-2 ice core data. The lower panel shows the past atmospheric CO2 in ppm, as found from the Epica Dome Sea ice core in the Antarctic, Monin et al. 2004, until 1850. Red lines represent 1850 to 2023 temperature and atmospheric CO2, as per NOAA. Note, central Greenland changes are not identical to global changes. However, they do tend to reflect global changes with a decadal scale delay. Box et al. 2009, with the exception of the Antarctic region, which is more or less in opposite phase. Chilek et al. 2010, even representing global temperature composite with very smooth curves. Drastic global temperature changes show no correlation to atmospheric CO2 changes in the last 12 KY until 1900 AD. Source: Nature. Global mean surface temperature from the Temperature 12K database, using 5 reconstruction methods colored curves. Even using the data of their jockey stick, temperature changes show no clear correlation with CO2 over the last 2,000 years, up to 1980. They pretend to make us believe that CO2 and temperature increases have a direct relationship, because the coefficient R2 is 0.9 for the period 1980 to 2023. But R2 has been practically zero or very low for centuries since 1 ed, and even for more recent periods such as 1852. 1940, 1850 to 1900, 1900 to 1940, 1940 to 1980. The recent past temperature changes show no relation to the atmospheric CO2 in the last 175 years until 1980. If we cut the timeline by periods, the R2 coefficient is only strong in the 1980 to 2023, or if we mix all the periods from 1850. Source of data: temperature, as per NASA GIST Global Land Ocean Temperature Index, CO2, as per atmospheric CO2 concentrations ppm derived from in situ air measurements at Mauna Loa Observatory, Hawaii, an historical CO2 record from the Law Dome des 08, des 08 to 2, and DSS ice cores. Ljungqvist reconstruction of temperature variability in the extratropical northern hemisphere during the last 2 millennia. Note the Roman and medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age from 15th century to 19th century. There is no correlation between temperature and CO2 in many periods. CO2 emissions from Industrial Revolution began in 1850. But since then, there have been long periods of cooling and warming. From 1940 to 50, human CO2 emissions began to be significant, but then global temps dropped for 30 to 40 years. The greenhouse gas theory only fits for warming periods. Source of chart, Met Office. If there is any correlation between CO2 and temperature, it is the reverse. Atmospheric CO2 increases after temperature increases. The main hypothesis is that the oceans release CO2 when they warm and dilute and retain it when they cool. But even this inverse correlation has not always been exactly the case, as data from different periods over the last 11,000 years show. Proxies of global temperature versus atmospheric CO2 in the last 800K years. Temperature rises first, then CO2. Proxies of global temperature versus atmospheric CO2 in the 2K to 165K years ago. Temperature rises first, then CO2. The main hypothesis is that the oceans release CO2 when they warm and dilute and retain it when they cool. Proxies of global temperature versus atmospheric CO2 in the 150K to 270K years ago. Now let's see the global temperature and CO2 proxies for the last 450 million years. In the long series, there is no correlation between atmospheric CO2 and temperatures. Some CO2 cycles coincide with mass extinctions, which supports the relationship between CO2 and biodiversity. Relationship between atmospheric CO2 and global temperature for the last 425 million years. Atmospheric CO2 is correlated weakly, but negatively, with linearly detrended temperature proxies over the last 425 million years. This study shows that changes in atmospheric CO2 did not cause temperature changes in the ancient climate. A prominent 15 million year CO2 cycle coincides closely with identified mass extinctions, suggesting a pressing need for research on the relationship between CO2, biodiversity, and related net zero carbon policies. The longest series of temperatures measured with thermometers, invented in 1612, is that of Central England, that begins in 1659. It shows that temperatures have been rising for about 300 years, and that here were periods of stronger and faster warming than the current one, not related to CO2, although the current one is distorted by the effect of growing cities. 1700 to 1740, stronger and faster warming than the present one. Human emissions of CO2 and atmospheric CO2 have no clear correlation. Due to lockdowns in 2020, during the pandemic, human CO2 emissions were reduced significantly, but atmospheric CO2 continued to rise without showing the slightest inflection point. In 2020, CO2 emissions were reduced significantly due to lockdowns, but atmospheric CO2 continued to rise without showing the slightest inflection point. In addition to the fact that there is no clear correlation between atmospheric CO2 and temperature, neither in the last 600 million years, nor in the last 10,000 years, Holocene, nor in the last 500 years, nor in the last 150 years, nor between 1940 and 1980. There is also no correlation between human CO2 emissions and atmospheric CO2 in 2020. CO2 emissions were reduced significantly due to lockdowns, but atmospheric CO2 continued to rise without showing the slightest inflection point. USA, gasoline consumption, thousands of barrels per day. It fell 14% in 2020 compared to 2019. And in 2022, it was still 6% below. USA, jet fuel consumption, thousands of barrels per day. It fell 38% in 2020 compared to 2019. And in 2022, it was still 9% below. World airline industry, number of passengers carried. It fell 62% in 2020 compared to 2019. And in 2022, it was still 20% below. Number of flights in the world airline industry versus atmospheric CO2. Compared to 2019, flights number in 2020 were minus 57%, in 2021 were minus 48%, in 2022 were minus 29%, in 2023 were 5.4%. However, atmospheric CO2 continued to grow steadily without showing the slightest inflection point. Oil consumption worldwide versus atmospheric CO2. Compared to 2019, oil consumption in 2020 was minus 8.9%. In 2021 was minus 3.5%. In 2022 was 0.5%. However, atmospheric CO2 continued to grow steadily without showing the slightest inflection point. In 2020, CO2 emissions were reduced significantly due to lockdowns, but atmospheric CO2 continued to rise without showing the slightest inflection point. Total anthropogenic CO2 emissions by fuel in GT versus atmospheric CO2 in ppm. 1960 to 2022. In 2020, CO2 emissions were reduced significantly due to lockdowns, but atmospheric CO2 continued to rise without showing the slightest inflection point. In addition to the fact that there is no clear correlation between atmospheric CO2 and temperature, neither in the last 600 million years, nor in the last 10,000 years Holocene, nor in the last 500 years, nor in the last 150 years, nor between 1940 and 1980, there is also no correlation between human CO2 emissions and atmospheric CO2 during the pandemic in 2020. CO2 emissions were reduced significantly, but atmospheric CO2 continued to rise without showing the slightest inflection point. China. During the pandemic, China took advantage of others' lockdowns to produce even more, which is reflected in their CO2 emissions that increased even in 2020. Currently, China emits much more than Europe in per capita terms. There is a discrepancy in the global warming calculations, depending on whether we average the data from urban and rural meteorological stations or only those from rural stations, because the urban stations are distorted upwards by the strong increase in human activity and the island effect of cities. There is a discrepancy in the global warming calculations, depending on whether we average the data from urban and rural meteorological stations or only those from rural stations, because the urban stations are distorted upwards by the strong increase in human activity and the island effect of cities. Nevertheless, both measurements show a global warming. The first one, urban and rural stations, with a trend line that implies a warming of plus 0.89 degrees Celsius in 100 years, and the second one, only rural, plus 0.55 degrees Celsius in 100 years. Northern Hemisphere land air temperatures. In Spain, the main rural and mountain areas Copernicus Era 5 cells show temperatures below the 30-year average during the 12 months from Sep 2023 to Sep 2024, while the main urban areas, also Copernicus Era 5 cells, show temperatures in the same range as the 30Y average or above. Since 1970, there has been an apparent increase in natural disasters, but this is due to the increased placement of human assets and wealth in the destructive path of nature, as well as political mismanagement, not because there have been more extreme weather events. Neither in Spain nor in the autonomous community of Valencia is there any increase in the frequency or intensity of torrential rainfall events. The chart in the next page shows the major rainfall events in Spain greater than 60 LM2 in 24 hours since 1940. The chart 2 pages ahead shows the rainfall events in Valencia region greater than 200 LM2 in 24 hours since 1945. The causes of the catastrophic floods in Valencia in 2024 were all political, unrelated to climate change. 1. Lack of effective and timely warning to the population. 2. Urbanization in areas that have been flooded recurrently for centuries. 3. Lack of investment in infrastructure. 4. Lack of cleaning of wadi beds. Spain 1940 to 2024. Major 24-hour torrential rainfall events by municipality. In red, those in the Valencia region. Rainfall events greater than or equal 200 LM2 in the autonomous community of Valencia, 1945 to 2024. Sources, Agencia Estatal de Meteorología, AMED, and Confederación Hidrográfica del Júcar, 1982. Cumulative rainfall LM2, 19 to October 21, 1982. Casa del Baron, October 20th, 1982. Estimated record in Spain of rainfall in 24 hours. Cumulative rainfall LM2 to November 4th, 1987. La Safor, November 3rd, 1987. Official record in Spain of rainfall in 24 hours. LM2. Cumulative rainfall LM2. October 29th, 2024. Turris, October 29th, 2024. Estimated record in Spain of rainfall in 1 hour. Barranco del Pollo. It's the river that overflowed its banks in Valencia in 2024. In 1956, the surrounding area was not urbanized, and the whole area was classified as flood-prone. Its current channel allows a maximum flow of 1,800 m3. On October 29, 2024, it overflowed with 2,300 m3. Turia River, Valencia. On October 29, 2024, it reached a flow of 1,400 cubic meters. It did not overflow. In the Great Flood of October 14, 1957, it reached 3,700 cubic meters. Barranco del Pollo. It's the river that overflowed its banks. The surrounding area is now highly urbanized, although the whole area was classified as flood-prone. Its current channel allows a maximum flow of 1,800 m3. On October 29, 2024, it overflowed with 2,300 m3. The Barranco del Pollo is one of the main watercourses that have fed the Albufera since its formation centuries ago. Turia River, Valencia. On October 29, 2024, it reached a flow of 1,400 m3s. It did not overflow. In the Great Flood of October 14, 1957, it reached 3,700 cubic meters. South of the city of Valencia, 1956 versus 2024, flood zone blue shading versus new urbanization since 1956 white outline. The blue flood zone is the superposition of the flood zones of the National Mapping System and those of the Patricova Viewer of the Generalitat Valenciana. Other historic floodings in Spain, the Great Flooding of Barcelona in 1862. Diario de Barcelona newspaper, Monday, September 15, 1862. The waters have flooded the stores of the Rambla, so that the families who occupy the first floor of the Conciliar Seminary have had to take refuge in the upper rooms of the same. At 1:30 in the afternoon, continued to flood the streets of Tallers, Buen Suceso, Carmen, and Immediate, because despite having stopped the rain, the current was still extraordinary. All the Rambla adjacent to these streets is full of stones, timbers, beams, carts, etc., that the water has brought from outside. Front cover of a magazine showing the great flooding of the Rambla of Barcelona on September 15, 1862. Engraving of the Rambla of Barcelona in the Middle Ages. It is evident that 1862 was not the first time it was flooded. If there is more wealth exposed to the elements, there is more destruction of wealth. A century ago in Miami, there were almost no buildings, and now there are large developments. When a hurricane hits now, there are large damages and are registered by insurance companies. But this does not mean that there are more hurricanes or that they are more damaging. The same applies to the wadis in the Mediterranean and other areas. A Category 2 hurricane striking Miami today could be more destructive than a Category 5 a century ago. Global major hurricane frequency, 12-month running sums, Trienmal. Updated November 30th, 2024. Last 30 years, 45.4 hours or 24.3 millions. Hurricanes in the U.S. The frequency of hurricanes has not increased. Since 1851, there have been many decades with more than 5 major hurricane strikes, and the frequency is decreasing. Heat waves in the U.S. The U.S. is where the most coherent long-term temperature records are. There has been a decline in heat wave frequency and intensity since the 1930s. Rainfalls in the U.S., where the most coherent and long-term records are. There has been a slight increase in annual precipitation since 1895. Contiguous U.S. monthly precipitation. The IPCC itself states in its AR5 report, 2013 to 2014, there remains no evidence regarding the sign of the trend in global flood magnitude and frequency. The data show that there is no significant trend in hurricane frequency over the last century, and more recent studies indicate that the number of hurricanes is unlikely to have increased over the last 100 years. Again, the IPCC, in its latest AR6 report, 2021 to 2023, makes it clear that general statements attributing changes in the probability or magnitude of floods to anthropogenic climate change deserve low confidence. At many times over the past 600 million years, atmospheric CO2 has been several orders of magnitude higher than today. We are in a CO2 famine. The Earth has been in a period of CO2 famine for the last several tens of millions of years. Atmospheric CO2 was not correlated with temperatures over the past 450 million years. Changes in atmospheric CO2 did not cause temperature changes in the ancient climate. Some CO2 cycles coincide closely with identified mass extinctions, suggesting the relationship between CO2 and biodiversity. Last 65 million years, CO2 is not the control knob. Reconstruction of atmospheric CO2 black line and temperature red line during the last 65 million years Cenozoic. Most of the time, both variables move in opposite directions, which is contrary to the correlation argued by the IPCC. The atmospheric CO2 proxy in black is given in ppm parts per million. The temperature proxy shown in red is given in D18O units. That is the fraction of oxygen 18 in the atmosphere, a function of atmospheric temperature. Approximate surface temperature averages, GAST, are given on the right side of the plot. Today we are near the minimum temperature for the past 65 million years. The effect of CO2 as a greenhouse gas is very small. If we double CO2 from 400 ppm to 800 ppm, so a 100% increase in CO2, something that at the current rate will take about 150 years, we will decrease infrared radiation to space by 1%. This will mean an increase in the Earth's surface temperature of less than 0.7 degrees Celsius in those 150 years. Over the last 420,000 years, all periods between glaciations have had temperatures higher than today's, and there have been many periods where temperatures rose at a rate equal to or much faster than the present. Reconstructed global temperatures over the last 420,000 years based on the Vostok ice core from the Antarctica. The horizontal line indicates the modern temperature level. All periods between glaciations have had temperatures higher than today's. There is also no correlation between temperature and CO2 during the last 12,000 years, Holocene. If there is any correlation, it is a slightly inverse correlation. There is no correlation between temperature and greenhouse gases during the Holocene 12K years. Black curve, global temperature reconstruction from 73 proxies, Macrot et al. 2013. Here, temperature's anomalies are expressed in z-score, or distance to the mean in standard deviation units. Purple curve, Earth's axis obliquity cycle. Red curve, CO2 levels as measured in Epica Dome Sea Antarctica ice core, as reported by Monin et al. 2004. Blue curve, methane levels as measured in GRIP GIST 2 and Neem Greenland ice cores, as reported by Kobashi et al. 2007. Major Holocene climatic periods are indicated at the top. Pink vertical bar is the 8.2 Kr air cooling event BPACE, reconstruction of the last 12,000 years Holocene regional temperatures. Global average surface temperature, GAST, hides a great deal of important detail since southern hemisphere temperature remained quite stable, while today the northern hemisphere temperature is near its minimum for the past 12,000 years. Antarctic, southern hemisphere, tropics, Arctic. There is no correlation between temperature and CO2 in the last 400 years, nor in the last 150 years, nor between 1940 and 1980. Northern hemisphere warming began, undated 350 years ago. World, Moberg et al. 2005 and Lundqvist 2010, among others, have reconstructed temperatures for the northern hemisphere from 1 to 1979 AD by using data from borehole drillings, tree rings, and lake sediments. These data show considerable variation in temperatures during the last 2,000 years, such as during the medieval age warming or the Little Ice Age. Northern hemisphere warming began minus 300 years ago. Lundqvist reconstruction of temperature variability in the extratropical northern hemisphere during the last 2 millennia. Note the Roman and medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age from 15th century to 19th century. Strange correlation. From approximately 1950, human CO2 emissions began to be significant, but then temperatures began to fall and did so for the next 30 years. From the 1980s onwards, temperatures began to rise. They have maintained their upward trend ever since for the last approximately 40 years. But they have not done so constantly, because they show some periods of stabilization. On the contrary, atmospheric CO2 has maintained a constant growth, with almost the same slope during the last 125 years. Therefore, the greenhouse gas theory only fits for certain warming periods. Strange correlation, global air temperature versus atmospheric CO2, 1960 through September 2023. The following graphs for England show the temperature and insolation, hours of sunshine or absence of clouds, since the latter has been measured in England 1910 against the evolution of atmospheric CO2 and human CO2 emissions. The correlation of temperature with hours of sunshine, absence of clouds, is almost perfect, but there is not correlation with CO2. England, temperature versus hours of sunshine versus atmospheric, CO2 1920 to 2022, in percentage, where 1920 equal to 100. Temperature versus hours of sunshine versus global human, CO2 emissions 1920 to 2022, in percentage, where 1920 equal to 100. There is no correlation between temperature and CO2. The greenhouse gas hypothesis can only explain global warming in those periods with rising temperatures. But there is a quasi-perfect parallelism between hours of sunshine and temperature since early 1900, correlation between low-altitude cloud cover and cosmic ray flux reaching Earth. There is an hypothesis that says it is the hours of sunshine, the absence of clouds, that causes the increase in temperatures, and that the hours of sunshine are not related to human CO2 emissions, but indirectly to solar magnetic activity. Another hypothesis maintains that galactic cosmic rays that reach Earth, which are mainly protons, play a key role in the formation of aerosols and clouds. In turn, the magnetic activity of the sun and the solar wind act as a shield against galactic cosmic rays, modulating indirectly the formation of clouds. Cosmic ray and sunspot variations over the instrumental period 1951 to 2018. Clouds reflect a large percentage of the solar energy they receive back to space, reducing Earth's warming. The decrease in cloudiness allows for greater sunshine, a greater number of hours of sunshine, not to be confused with solar irradiation. More clouds cool the Earth, fewer clouds warm it. The increase in temperature would be caused by the sun, but not by the variations in its irradiation, which, according to NASA, have not had an impact on the recent warming, but by the variations in the solar wind that blocks cosmic rays and the cloud formation. Nobel laureate in physics 2022, John Clauser maintains that the effect of greenhouse gases is negligible compared to the reflection of sunlight from clouds. Warming means more evaporation and more clouds. These provide cooling, and this is how the climate feeds back and maintains itself. Since the 1980s, both in England and worldwide, there has been a trend towards less cloudiness, higher temperatures. The less clouds, the higher the temperature, and vice versa. In contrast, there is no correlation between CO2 and cloud insolation variation. Part of the heat may be coming from beneath our feet. 1600 to 1850, magnetic North Pole goes south. In parallel, the Little Ice Age occurred. In 1850, it began to move northward at an accelerated rate, especially since 1980. At the same time, nearly with a perfect correlation, global temperatures increased, also especially since 1980. Is this change in the configuration of magnetism increasing the activity of mid-ocean ridges and/or changing the ocean currents, especially in North Atlantic? Part of the heat may indeed be coming from beneath our feet. Magma from the Earth's interior rises along the mid-ocean ridge, then cools to form new seafloor rock. Since 1859, the magnetic North Pole has been moving from south to north, from 1990 and 2000 onwards at an accelerated rate. 1810, 1859, 1950. Has this influenced the activity of mid-ocean ridges and/or ocean currents, and thus climate change? In 1859, the Earth experienced the largest recorded solar storm. Also in 1859, the magnetic North Pole changed 180° the direction of its drift and began its northward excursion. Contrary to the North Pole, magnetic South Pole movement is very slow. No one understands why in 2023 the global average temperature of the oceans rose so suddenly and so much, nor why. From June 2024 onwards, it began to fall, also rapidly, reaching this December the level it had in 2015. Atmospheric CO2 cannot explain these strong variations. So why? Part of the heat may indeed be coming from beneath our feet. Magma from the Earth's interior rises along the mid-ocean ridge, then cools to form new seafloor rock. The older seafloor spreads away, becomes cold and dense, and sinks or subducts back into the Earth's interior under the continents. After a very warm 2023 and 2024, in 2025, air and sea temperatures in various parts of the globe seem to be returning to the 30 years reference, 1991 to 2020 median. Regarding Arctic sea ice extent, after growing between 1952 and 1970 and shrinking between 1979 and 2004, no statistically significant decline has been observed since 2005. Regarding the Antarctic sea ice extent, after being stable since 1979, it experienced a decline in 2023 to 2024, but in 2025 seems to be returning to the average. Antarctic sea ice extent 1979 to 2022, very stable. 2023 to 2024, contraction. 2023, record low. Charctic interactive sea ice graph. Antarctic sea ice extent 2025 seems to be returning to mean. Charctic interactive sea ice graph. Arctic sea ice extent 1979 to 2020, contraction. However, no statistically significant decline between 2005 and 2025. 2005 Arctic sea ice extent, no statistically significant decline between 2005 and 2025. Arctic sea ice extent, no statistically significant decline between 2005 and 2025. Hunga Tonga, January 2022. Many scientists suspect that the sudden rise in temperature over 2023 and 2024 has been influenced by the eruption of Hunga Tonga in 2022, which injected a huge amount of water vapor into the stratosphere. It was one of the largest eruptions of the last 25,000 years. Unlike others, it did not expel ash into the atmosphere, which causes cooling of the planet, but water vapor. Water vapor is by far the main greenhouse gas. Water vapor in the atmosphere causes global warming due to its strong greenhouse effect. The Hunga Tonga produced a gigantic cloud of H2O vapor of a 60 kilometers high, with a surface area of hundreds of thousands of km2. It is the largest volcanic plume ever recorded. For reference, the highest clouds reach 11 kilometers in height, the most common are below 5 kilometers, and the Hiroshima bomb plume reached 12 kilometers. According to the IPCC, up to 75% of the greenhouse effect is produced by water vapor in the stratosphere and mesosphere, 50%, and clouds in the lower troposphere, 25%. The British Isles were formed due to a global warming much more abrupt than today's, occurring around 6,250 BC. In just one person's lifetime, temperatures rose 1.5 degrees, the ice that covered Canada melted, sea levels rose, and the British Isles were cut off from the continent. Click on this link to see a short video. Glaciers have been shrinking at about the same rate since 1825. Watch how glaciers worldwide have been shrinking based on actual photos and measurements. Glacier du Rhône. Glacier du Rhône. Click on this link to see a short video of actual photos of glaciers shrinking since 1849. Glaciers worldwide, on average, have been shrinking at about the same rate since 1825, while significant CO2 emissions began in 1950. The chart shows the evolution since 1700 of the length of 169 glaciers worldwide, from North and South hemispheres. Some glaciers have been shrinking very rapidly since 1750, well before the Industrial Revolution. The chart shows the evolution since 1700 of the length of 5 glaciers worldwide, in continental Norway, in Svalbard glacial Arctic Islands, in New Zealand and Western Canada, and in Jan Mayen Island near Iceland. Australia's Great Barrier Reef is healthier and more extensive than ever. In 2024, it has continued its strong natural growth. Cows and their methane cannot be the cause of climate change either, because there have always been millions more ruminants in the wild than there are now on farms. When Europeans arrived in America, it is estimated that there were over 60 million buffalo on the Great American Prairies and over 30 million deer and elk. All of them ruminants, a number greater than the approximately 90 million heads on all farms and ranches in the United States each year. The photo shows the result of one of the indiscriminate slaughter of buffalo in 19th century North America. There is no correlation between temperature and CO2 in the last 425 million years, nor in the last 12,000 years, nor in the last 400 years, nor in the last 150 years, nor between 1940 and 1980. Greenhouse gases are not the main driver of climate change. There are other important radiative forces like solar, orbital, and ocean variations, volcanism, tropospheric aerosols, galactic cosmic rays, etc. But the surprising proposition of man-made climate change scientists is that nearly all climate change since 1850 has been due to humans. They even argue that the 1940 to 1980 global drop of temperatures can be explained by the cooling effect of man-made tropospheric aerosols. Did they suddenly disappear at a point in time, in 1980? Perhaps what they are trying to do when they insist on their belief in a stable and benign climate that is suddenly thrown out of balance by human action, despite all the paleoclimatic records to the contrary, is to test our sense of humor. If they truly believe that CO2 is the main driver of climate change, they are acting very badly in the great theater of the world. CO2 prices and the share of national emissions subject to pay for CO2 rights vary widely from country to country. The great theater of the world, CO2 prices and percent covered vary widely from country to country. Since 1995 COP1, the EU and the US reduced their CO2 emissions, but China has replaced them because in doing so, they have let China replace their industries. Global per capita emissions have grown from 4.1 TN to 4.8 TN, and will continue to do so for many years to come, as South America, India, and Africa catch up. But it doesn't matter, because CO2 is not the cause of climate change. COP climate conferences versus total atmospheric CO2. While human CO2 emissions per capita have been growing with some sawtooth, the biggest drop took place during the lockdowns. Total atmospheric CO2 has continued to grow without showing any significant tipping points or sawtooth, not even during the Lehman crisis, nor during the pandemic, nor following any of the COP conferences, and after trillions of taxes transferred to climate change corporations. There is no green energy transition, no renewable energy revolution. Global electricity production from fossil fuels has grown plus 53% per capita since COP1 in 1995. Per capita, when it will continue to do so strongly as South America, India, and Africa catch up. The level of CO2 in the atmosphere is lower now than it has been throughout most of Earth's history. CO2 is currently 0.042% of the atmosphere, far short of the optimum for plant growth. CO2 is plant food, which is 2 to 3 times higher than the current level. Plants take up water through their roots and CO2 through their leaves through sophisticated pores called stomata, the mouths of plants that open and close depending on their need for food. If the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is low, the leaves generate or open their stomata to the maximum to capture sufficient CO2. Many stomata are very open to compensate for the low CO2 concentration, causes much of the water in the leaves to be lost by evaporation. This forces plants to absorb much more water from the soil, increasing water consumption. With a higher CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, plants grow more and need less water, increasing agricultural productivity. Graphic reminder of why CO2 is not a pollutant, but the food of plants, and why CO2 fixation through photosynthesis is the basis of life on Earth. Hemoglobin. Vegetation cover is increasing over much of the planet. Global greening from CO2 fertilization, 1982 to 2010. All the CO2 from fossil fuels that we are putting into the atmosphere, where does it come from? How did it become oil? From plants and phytoplankton, which ate the CO2 that was in the atmosphere and in the oceans, and as they died, generation after generation, they turned into coal, oil, and gas. So all we're doing is replenishing the carbon dioxide that was originally in the atmosphere? If there's not enough CO2 for the plants, we're all going to die too, because plants are the base of the food chain. We are replenishing CO2 to a much better level for plants and agricultural production than had been left after it, had been captured, removed from the atmosphere by plants, and fixed in the form of fossil fuels for millions of years. Man is the true salvation of life on Earth. No other species could do what we have done. burning fossil fuels for energy and replenishing CO2 in the atmosphere to allow a new flowering of the biosphere's vegetation cover. A completely different issue from climate change and its causes is how to stop polluting ecosystems with unrecycled waste and chemicals. But CO2 is not one of them. CO2 is not a pollutant, it is a fertilizer. In Africa, we are rich in natural gas, oil, and coal, but we are poor. You impose on us supposedly green climate policies that have no effect on the climate and perpetuates our poverty. We consume the annual equivalent of 1 barrel per person, while in the West you consume 13 barrels per person.